This video is on a martial art that deserves way more attention. And no, to your surprise, I'm not talking about Duke's Ryu Ninjutsu. This video is on KOSEN Judo.
Pow pow, inside fighting, yeah, dangerous martial arts. Pow pow, ooh ah.
So before I get started, if you've watched any of my other videos or you like this video by the end, please like and subscribe, ring the bell, blah 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 blah, blah 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 blah, and whatever else you're supposed to do. All the little things that help this channel grow, I'd really appreciate it. Okay, I'm gonna jump right in. KOSEN Judo. First, I have to talk about my own stupidity here and admit that in my experience with martial arts, I grew up doing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. I did Sambo. And to my knowledge, Jiu-Jitsu was like the ground fighting, elite, supreme. I believe Helio Gracie, kind of was the major contributor to what ground fighting is today. And that when he saw, I knew the stories of Maeda and I knew the stories of how he came from Japan and lived with his family and how he would watch, this is the story at least I was told about kind of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, was that he would watch, and because he was smaller, he developed his own style because they didn't even let him train with them. And that because he was so small, he developed a ground fighting system. Now, look, I don't know what's true. I don't know what's not true. I do know that a lot of martial arts are cultish. Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is not immune to this. And so there's a lot of hype, especially around Helio Gracie, the history of Jiu-Jitsu, how many matches everyone has won, how many matches people have lost. And this does not take away from Jiu-Jitsu. I till today do think that Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is the most unique, advanced grappling ground fighting system. I don't think it's the most advanced throwing system. I think it's sorely lacking in that area. And I do think it's even shifted away from being an effective self-defense system in many ways. But when it comes to the complexity, the understanding, and the time given to ground fighting, it's an incredibly beautiful and unique system, and it is a chess game. Why am I ranting about Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu? KOSEN Judo is really, really linked to Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu specifically. Not only in history, but also in the way they approach ground fighting. Now let's first just analyze modern day Judo. Modern day Judo was heavily influenced by wanting to be appealing to the masses. And what's appealing to the masses? Being thrown, being whipped in the air, hip tossed. Things like double leg takedowns are not nearly as interesting. A lot of like things you would see in Greco-Roman wrestling are not as interesting to people as when you see a beautiful judo throw executed. And so Jigoro Kano really wanted to spread his art. Now, as early as 1925, from my understanding, the rule set of what judo was started changing Kodokan Judo to become more explosive, more fast-paced, and more appealing to the masses. Now, I've said this before, Olympics, the rules of the Olympics and trying to push your sport onto the masses, your martial art onto the masses, can sometimes be a huge detractor from the effectiveness of the martial art and take away things that made it great. I'm not saying judo's not great. I still think it's a fantastic throwing system, but I do think it sorely lacks in what people call newaza, ground fighting, which is where Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu shines. I won't get into Sambo. Sambo's a whole other argument. Sambo has a very unique aspect of both of those things, and I think Sambo is a very complete martial art in general, combat Sambo specifically, but I'll get into that in another video. We're looking at Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and Judo right now, specifically KOSEN Judo. So Judo developed in this kind of unique way to be something completely kind of, I would say, filling the gap of what modern day Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu doesn't give you, which is really good throws, really good stand-up, really good gi throws specifically, which you wouldn't get out of a gi-less grappling system, like a no-gi system, like wrestling. And Jiu-Jitsu, I would also attribute to the huge spike in modern day grappling systems, like combat Jiu-Jitsu, which is a no-gi system where you're allowed to strike, which also gives it a lot more reality-based self-defense aspects. Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu has led into other systems like no-gi grappling competitions, and a lot of those guys have wrestling backgrounds, but then they're heavily based in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu too. So it's kind of the gold standard of grappling systems today. Everyone will have some contact with Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. But saying that those systems come from Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and then not acknowledging truly where Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu came from and why it's so ground heavy is a disservice to that very lineage I'm paying credit to. I can't pay credit to Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu as the father of these subsystems like modern day combat Jiu-Jitsu and all these no-gi kind of competitions, ADCC and all these things, and then not say, well, let's look at KOSEN Judo. So let's look at KOSEN Judo. KOSEN Judo really, there's a sticky history here. But Kosen Judo in itself, Kosen just means higher learning. And Kosen Judo is a rule set for judo that is based in ground fighting, much heavier than modern day judo. It's the original judo that was not yet pushed onto the masses in many ways to be shifted to be strictly a stand-up or more heavy stand-up system. Not to say judo doesn't have any newaza, but not much. And so Kosen Judo is heavy newaza based, and it is a university and high school based system. Now, interestingly enough, when you look at Kosen Judo, one of the reasons it was taught in schools to students, young students, was not only because they're more physical, and so ground fighting, continuing on the ground newaza for much longer, allowed people to excel in that area, but also because teachers believed that it would give you a more strategic mindset to do newaza, to do ground fighting. Because you can't just pull off a quick explosive movement. Throws are usually completed in, you do set them up, there are chain throws, there are things like that, but if you look at the nature of a throw, it's a very physical, quick act. It's not something that can take time and be slow, and you can't really crush somebody the way jiu-jitsu is. And there's not the same degree of human chess that takes place as when you're on the ground. And so they wanted to develop students in a way that would also give them a better ability to transfer these skills in life in general. At least that's what I've read online, and I think that's a very interesting differential between randori, stand-up throws, and newaza, which is ground fighting, that it really does develop a different mindset. Oddly enough, I always loved Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu for that. Most people who start training Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu become obsessive about it, because it becomes this thing of, you do step A, I do step B, which opens up a whole new series of events. Now you do step C, I have these whole chain of events that I can do. And it becomes a real chess game with your body. You have to be, to some degree, an intelligent person. You have to truly understand human anatomy and understand how the body works and start thinking and having non-linear approaches to your game to really excel at Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And really, that's the same thing that they were giving students back in the day. We're talking about the early 1900s in Kosen Judo. It really all comes from there. Now, Hajime Isogai is a guy who was training judo back in the day, who believed that newaza was more effective. And supposedly there was this rivalry between two high schools, and one student won with newaza techniques, so the other school started learning more newaza techniques, and then they won. And so they realized that newaza was a huge part of the game that could make you a better grappler, and started developing it in high schools and into universities. And again, this started getting kind of bled out as the sport wanted to get more mainstream appeal and wanted to kind of push itself onto the masses. But universities in Japan still teach Kosen Judo, and there are still some really good Kosen Judo guys, a little bit older now, the ones that are my favorite. But if you actually look at Maeda, if you look at the creation of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, Kimura, the guy who beat Helio Gracie, and if you don't know this fight, Helio Gracie wanted to prove himself against the judo world by fighting the most legendary judo fighter of all time, which was Kimura. And the reason a Kimura is named a Kimura is because he was caught by Kimura in a Kimura. I've said Kimura more times now than I've ever said it in my life, but that's pretty much what happened. So to honor him, they named the technique after him. It's, this kind of, a Kimura is basically a chicken wing, I guess you would call it in catch, but you're pretty much cranking the arm that way. And so that all comes from Kosen Judo. And actually, so if you look at like the first real huge matchup between Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and Kosen Judo, it was a loss. Now, that's not to say that there weren't other factors at play. The size of Helio Gracie, the age of Helio Gracie compared to Kimura, a ton of factors. And that's not to say that Helio Gracie didn't beat Kosen Judo guys leading up to that event, but you can't deny the history of Kosen Judo and its ability to ground fight in the kind of overall spectrum of what grappling arts are today and the impact that it had in grappling arts today. I would argue that newaza or ground fighting, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, all these things are heavily, heavily, heavily influenced by Kosen Judo. And a lot of people make the opposite argument. I don't see a foundation for it. And so you look at like the early 1900s, that's where these rule sets were being created and are still practiced in some schools in Japan until today. Now, once they get out of that and they want to have a career in judo, they do have to switch to more randori-based approaches to fighting, which is more stand-up sparring, less ground fighting because it's so quick. So let's look at Kosen Judo rule sets. Kosen Judo rule sets allow you to stay on the ground unless you stall the position. In other words, if I'm in your guard and nothing is advancing and neither of us is making an effort to change the position, they'll stand us up. Also, you can still win by a pin if you hold the person down for 20 seconds, which I think is a valid kind of approach to differentiating themselves even today from Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, because it does give a lot of effectiveness to a pin. And if you can pin someone for 20 seconds, that's a very long time. And you have kind of controlled them at that point. You are now in a street situation, if we're looking at the effectiveness from a self-defense point of view, deciding if they can move or not. And one of the things that I think a lot of spectators don't like in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is if there's a 20-minute match and it's just a guy in another guy's guard and it's not going anywhere. So KOSEN Judo led to some other great fighters I want to give credit to. There's a guy, Yuki Nakai, who was an amazing grappler. And these are some cool old school grapplers. And if you like grappling, you should look up Yuki Nakai's fight. He was sadly blinded by a very dirty fighter who also fought in UFC 1, but we won't get into that. Yuki Nakai also fought Rickson Gracie, and he's significantly smaller than Rickson, and was just a really good grappler back in the day, really dynamic, ahead of his time. Another one who impacted my style greatly is Koji Komuro. Koji Komuro is a judo guy, black belt in judo, who at one point was competing against a lot of the high-level jiu-jitsu guys and really came up the ranks. And he had such a unique ground game, and it heavily influenced my game, and I would go fight in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu with his game. He was really into the Ezekiel choke, and part of the reason for that is in judo, they do keep bigger gis. They just fight with bigger gis typically. Like jiu-jitsu guys have learned to just get within regulation length, and a lot of guys in the gym when they're sparring wear gis that are as tight as a sweater, and you can't really get an Ezekiel choke as easily, and it just changes the game a little bit. Those slight differences make such a difference when you're grappling, by the way. And so Koji Komuro had a little bit of a thicker gi, and he would Ezekiel choke, and if you don't know what an Ezekiel choke is, it's like a sleeve choke where you're just compressing the person's neck from everywhere. He would do it on the bottom, on the top, and it was just a beautiful application of that choke. Another thing he did is what he coined the calm lock, which is essentially an overhook guard, but he cranks the arm and he gets into a straight arm bar. Now, if you haven't seen Koji Komuro, I'll show some clips of his techniques over here. I think he's super unique as a grappler, and it just shows how the development of KOSEN Judo still has a lot of validity today. I also do, once again, and again, it's one of the things that's sorely lacking in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu today is I'm a very big transitional kind of fighter. I believe transitions, when you're at an elite level, are where fights are won and where they're lost. You usually cannot just set up, even in a linear way, a kind of series of events to tap somebody out or catch somebody if they're at your level. But what you can do is in those little scrambles, or when it gets a little bit chaotic and where you're both a little behind on what you want to do, be the guy who's just slightly better at getting what they want. And so fights are won in those little transitional moments in any combat sport, even in striking, in grappling, in MMA. The transitions are where fights are won. And I think that's an important part of fighting. And what KOSEN Judo gets right, just because of how it's grown, is it's not only focused on newaza, or overly heavily focused on newaza, and it's not overly focused on randori. It has a beautiful, which is stand-up fighting, it has a beautiful kind of integration, seamless integration of both. And so you really get a nice gi-based or kimono-based, whatever you want to call it, your uniform approach to having your takedown into ground fighting really smooth. This is not to say that there's not Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu guys who aren't amazing at this. There's Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu guys whose takedowns are fabulous. But in all my years of training Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, which is 23 years now, I've trained at a lot of schools, I've trained with world champions. I do not find the same degree, at least not on a wide scale, of ability to control someone on their feet as I do in judo schools when I go there. And so KOSEN Judo guys have elite level stand-up, and it's a part of their game from day one. Now, one thing I will say, which is a con, is that every injury I have had in grappling, every single one, in combat sports, I've done striking my whole life, I've done ground fighting my whole life, and I've even done a lot of wrestling-based styles. Like I said, Sambo, and every injury I had, whether it was a competition or whether it was, and I tore my ACL in a competition, in a Sambo competition, terrible knee injury, my meniscus tore, my ACL tore, my bones smashed into each other. every single injury was in either taking someone down or being taken down. And that happened in classes where I wasn't even sparring, where we were just doing the technique and someone just didn't do it right, or it happened in sparring, or it happened in competition. Throws are the most dangerous part of grappling. And so if you want to preserve your body long term, I do have a hesitancy against being in a heavily based stand-up throwing system, especially as you age. And it just becomes harder and harder and harder to take those injuries. If you look at like the cranking of your knees, shoulder, even fingers, wrists, all that stuff tends to happen on impact on the ground, especially when you're reaping on a throw. And those type of things are sometimes life-altering injuries. In fact, in my area here, a kid was recently paralyzed for a fireman carry where the guy sprawled him, and they weren't even sparring, they were just doing the technique, and he was an elite level guy. He's a brown belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and his life is very different now. And so sometimes I do ask myself, how worth it is it to really, really focus on takedowns? How much of a part of my life do I need this to be versus my safety? And I know that's a weird thing to say because we're martial artists, but I also worry about my longevity. I worry about being able to provide work. And so that's a huge part of kind of my apprehensions at this point in my life toward things like judo specifically. And even I would say, sadly, KOSEN Judo, which still focuses on newaza a lot, but still does focus equally on the randori, which again is the pro, for me is also a con, because I just don't want to be doing a gi-based throwing system at this point in my life with sparring with that. Now, what I will say is there's an interesting resurgence toward KOSEN Judo in some competitions where they've changed the judo rules to kind of honor the original KOSEN Judo style rules, which happened in those universities. KOSEN Judo is a very hard system to come by, so if you're lucky enough to come by it, I would train it. Although, again, training in a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu school and supplementing some judo would also give you a very similar skill set. So I just wanted to jump into my thoughts on KOSEN Judo. I think it's an incredibly unique system in the sense that we don't give it enough appreciation for the history that it really attributed to all modern day martial arts. You look at Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and people are like, that's the father of UFC. Well, the father of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is KOSEN Judo. And so we have to start honoring that and paying attention to that. And looking at the fighters that really kind of in that system did a lot of damage to other fighters. Like I said, Kimura, Maeda, Yuki Nakai, Koji Komuro, and there's a lot of others. And so I always wonder why some martial arts just don't get the attention they deserve. KOSEN Judo is a big one for me. In fact, most people you hear judo, they just think Kodokan Judo, and they don't realize that there's this whole other system that even today is still being taught in universities that is far closer to Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and has all that groundwork. And that Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, not to take anything away from it, is not really the father of newaza like a lot of people like to give it credit for. And again, that doesn't take anything away from Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. It's just being truthful and honoring what KOSEN Judo is. And that's all I have to say today. I don't know if any of that made sense. But again, if you like this video, like and subscribe and blah, blah, blah. Blah, 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 blah. I hope you liked it.